Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Today, we have astrologer Demetra George with us. We are very honored and very happy to have her. Thank you, Demetra, for joining us today.
Okay, it's thrilling for me to be connecting with an audience in Italy. I've had the great good fortune to travel there several times, and so my heart and mind is filled with all of the images that I've seen there.
It's very nice to hear that. So, just to introduce you a little bit to our viewers, Demetra specializes in Hellenistic astrology, and she has done a lot of work also with the asteroids and with a focus on feminine energy. But she have all the time to tell us about that. She's authored many books, including some about the lunar phases, with a focus on the dark phase of the moon and how we can go through that journey and how to get the best out of it. So, Demetra, how would you explain your field of Hellenistic astrology to a newbie?
The origins of astrology go back at least 4,000 years from the present time in a continuous stream. And it was developed 2,000 years in Babylonia, Mesopotamia era. And then the astrological teachings came to the Greek-speaking world after the conquests and death of Alexander the Great. And at that point, many people from Greece and Rome encountered the teachings of the Babylonians, and there was a new international capital built in Alexandria, Egypt. And it was in this melding of an indigenous Egyptian tradition of astrology, especially connected with the Decan stars, and the work on the zodiac and the risings and settings of planets from Babylonia, and Greek philosophy and astronomy that all melded together in the early centuries BC. And out of that melange arose what we call Hellenistic astrology. And it was the astrology as in the basic form we know it today, that had planets, signs, houses, and aspects, and a birth time of an individual. And the chart could both predict the character and the course of events for an individual. So that's what places it there. However, many of the texts that were written, hundreds of them, in the Greek language, but by astrologers from all around the Mediterranean basin from many different countries, those texts became buried or hidden for the most part with the fall of Rome and that area being conquered by Vandals and Goths and Visigoths who didn't value education as much as the classical Greeks had. And then with the advent of Christianity, astrology was also outlawed as a competitive system of prophecy to Christian revelation. So much of that material, most of it got lost in the archives or private collections of individuals. Some of it went to Persia, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But then those texts sat forgotten for almost 2,000 years until there was a project starting in 1900 by European scholars to translate the Greek astrological texts and to find them and to make critical additions and then translate them. And it's been since the late 1990s that the contemporary astrology community has had access to the kind of astrology that was formulated and practiced at the very beginning of our tradition. So that's sort of a historical context. So I've been involved in the process of both translating and reconstructing, interpreting, and teaching many of these astrology books by our forebears.
Oh, that's really wonderful. Thank you for the historical
Yeah.
introduction. So we know that you're extensively educated in the classic field. You've talked about Greek and Roman history, and we also know that you have a passion for mythology and that culture that lies there. How do you feel this passion for mythology influenced your journey into astrology and, the spiritual realm?
Well, it started almost at the very beginning of my astrology. Well, it really started as a child because all of my grandparents were Greek, and I lived with both of my grandmothers in my early years. And part of my bedtime stories were the stories of the Greek gods and goddesses. So as a very young child, I had those stories like swimming around in my mind. And with, the child's love of the fairy tales that you associate with that comfort of snuggling up to a loved one and being told stories. That was always there, but I didn't really know how I would use it. And 2 years into my astrological studies, and at that time I was about 25, 26. I went to my first conference, and a friendly looking person standing next to me in the lobby, waiting for the first event to begin, greeted me and started up a conversation. And that was Eleanor Bach, who is responsible for the very first asteroid ephemeris being published. In fact, it had just come off the press and she had some brand new copies in her handbag. And the asteroids were named after 4 of the great goddesses of mythology: Ceres, Pallas, Juno, and Vesta, which corresponded to the Greek deities of Demeter and Athena and Hera and Hestia. And when she found out my name was Demetra, which was the equivalent of Ceres, and she looked up Ceres in the chart and she saw it was opposite my sun, she said, "Here, I think you should have a copy of my book." So at that point, I took the asteroid ephemeris with just very few tentative suggestions and began to put those asteroids in the charts of my friends. And I would say, "I don't really know what this means, but let me tell you the story. And, just can you relate to it?" And people began to say, "Oh my goodness, you've just told me the story of my life." And we began to see how when a celestial body is prominent in the sky at the moment a person is born, then the story of the god or goddess who shares the name with that planet or asteroid becomes a major theme in their life. And many of the events of their lives that they had previously seen as discrete events start coming together into a mythic pattern, and the shape of what the meaning of their life is, what the trajectory is, what are the lessons that they're here to learn and experience, all come into focus. And it was really through mythology that brought me to those kinds of profound insights and working with myth in the chart and people's life experiences.
Wow, thank you. So continuing on this thread about the asteroids, do you think that astrologers in general, people who work in your field, have given the proper attention to this celestial body, or do you feel it was bypassed a little?
Well, more and more. So the asteroid ephemeris, the astrologers were aware of the asteroids by the late 1800s, but there were no ephemerides by which to place them into charts because they have very eccentric orbits, and it needed an astronomer to hand calculate because this was pre-computer. And in the 1970s, Eleanor Bach spent years trying to find and convince an astronomer to do these astronomical calculations. She finally succeeded. So it was 1973 that the first asteroid ephemeris became available to astrologers to work with this material. And at first, of course, most astrologers were very dismissive and skeptical. And I remember encountering things like, oh, like, what do you mean, like floating pieces of gravel in the solar system? Or we're doing fine with the 10 planets we already have. We don't need anything else to clutter and change our charts. And in fact, I heard that was the very same line that in the 1930s, astrologers had about Pluto. What do we need another planet for? We're doing fine with the 9 planets we have. So that there is a natural resistance among the collective of astrologers to be open to integrate new information, especially when they've worked out their system and it works fine for the client consultations they're having. So they don't want to scramble up something like, the phrase, if it's like not broken, don't fix it. So there was definitely resistance, and I can't help but wondering if, because these were named after feminine goddesses, there was also a bias against the feminine, because in 1977, when Chiron came on, Chiron was quickly to be embraced. And I said, hey, wait a second, like, what's going on here? And so I certainly felt frustration at that time. And at a certain point, I realized that I was an unknown young astrologer filled with this like burning passion for this new part of astrology that I felt I discovered, but none of the professionals were very interested in listening to me. And we're now moving into the 80s. And one of the things that was happening in our culture was the groundswell of women's spirituality and the rediscovery of the goddess and women's circles. And during those years, I worked collaboratively with Vicki Noble, who many of your listeners may be aware of with the Mother Peace Tarot. And I know Vicki has taught a lot in Italy over the decades. And we did retreats and weekends and day-long events for women where I would place these feminine goddesses in their charts. And then in a very simple manner, like that was outlined in the Astrology for Yourself workbook, help them identify which of the goddesses was most prominent in their own chart and what stories were relevant for their lives. And that was a very emotionally moving and profound experience as women came into the larger understanding of the power of the goddess and her suppression over millennia and what it meant to reclaim a feminine defined wisdom and creativity. And I realized then that many of these participants would never be astrologers themselves, but these were people who went to astrologers for readings. And as they went to their local or favorite astrologer, and they go, but what about Ceres in my chart? Or you haven't told me about Juno. Then that created a pressure on the mainstream astrologers to begin learning about the asteroids, because it was too difficult for them to say to a client, oh, I'm sorry, I don't know about this thing that you obviously feel is really important. And so in that way, from the grassroots up, the use of the asteroids has gained a lot more traction now, 50 years later. it's not uncommon for Ceres, Pallas, Juno, and Vesta to be incorporated in many charts. And for those communities who haven't been aware of them, it's always profound and shattering and exciting to be exposed to these teachings. Of course, now with the advances in astronomy and computers, we have about 26,000 asteroids that can be placed in charts. And there are ways that I work with all of those as well.
Wow. Wow. Thank you again. I did not expect it to be such a, impactful journey. But you've mentioned a lot about, the name of the goddesses, so all very feminine. Would it be okay to assume that these asteroids have a particular effect and impact on the lives of women specifically, or does this feminine energy also relate to men in some measure?
Yes and yes. Okay. They especially have an impact on women because in our 10-planet system, and I'm counting Pluto as a planet here, okay, just because 8 of the planets are modeled after masculine archetypal gods, and only 2, the Moon and Venus, after feminine goddesses. And by and large, until the 1970s, the roles that women had through which to express themselves were limited to wives and mothers, being represented by Moon and Venus. And with what's the word? Synchronicity. I can't think of the form of that word that I want to use. But when those ephemerides became available to astrologers, this corresponded to the women's consciousness movement and the rise of feminism and the second and third waves of feminism sweeping the global level. And at this point, many more roles and options became available politically, culturally, legally for women to enter into education and athletics and careers and all kinds of arenas of expression. And the asteroids in the chart provided symbols for astrologers to address this expanded feminine activity that was erupting in the culture as being something that had always belonged to us, but had never been articulated or supported or named. And so on that level, the 2 issues came together of an increased participation by women in the larger world, as well as more feminine defined astrological symbols in the chart. And the story is much bigger, but let me just address the second part of your question as well. Do they have an effect for men as well? And my answer to that is yes. And one of the strongest examples is the asteroid Ceres, who is the Great Mother. And she represents that relationship between mother and children. And with the 60s and 70s, we saw fathers being allowed to be present at the birth of their children, which previously the father was always told, hey, like, go to the lobby, go to the den, like have some whiskey and we'll tell you when it's all over. Okay. And now that they're present in the birth process of their children, and they began increasingly to participate in the holding and feeding and nurturing of their infants, which before this time was considered like, men don't do that. And then this also led for fathers requesting custody of their children in separations and being awarded custody of their children. So we saw a much greater movement of men into traditional women's territory around the issue of infants and childbirth. And so I'm going to take this back a few more steps now to give a theoretical answer for what we saw. And there is one of the theories of the workings of astrology is as above, so below. And the notion that humans are a microcosm of the larger macrocosm.
Okay.
And so when new celestial bodies are seen, discovered, and named external to us, that corresponds to an internal awakening of that center of consciousness that has always been within us as a potentiality, but now the light switch has been turned on. So when the asteroids were first discovered, beginning in 1800, right before that is when we really saw the beginnings of the women's movement, and Mary Wollstonecraft publishing on the vindication of the rights of women. And then women born in around the 1800s, in that first decade or two after the discovery of the asteroids, when they came of age, these were women who formed the first Seneca Falls Convention, in which the notion of patriarchy was first defined, and so on. And I have a 4-hour 2-set tape series on the history of feminism, corresponding with the discovery of the asteroids, and charts of feminist leaders who were initially tied with the abolitionists, and how the asteroids are so prominent in all of these charts. As they came forth, they were promoting what they stood for in changing culture. So we see that process of like outer and inner happening simultaneously as it transforms the shape of the world we live in. And the asteroids have had a huge part to play in that process in the last 200 years.
It's fascinating. It's also very refreshing to see, women and the whole feminist movement to be, at the center of history and how the stars have influenced it all. So we also know that you have led many pilgrimages to sacred sites in all of Europe, even Italy, you've said.
Yes.
So what do you think the goal is when you do? How was the experience, and what did it help you learn while you were there in those places?
Well, the trips were glorious, as just the whole process of traveling always is, no matter what. Having the experience to connect with wisdom and culture that is not your own, and to broaden your mind in the fullest sense of our Sagittarian ninth house impulses. In particular, the way that I merged the astrology and travel to sacred sites is planning itineraries that went to the temples of different gods and goddesses. And the names of those deities, as well as the place names, like Delphi, for example, were asteroids. And by pulling out the asteroids that related to the places that we were going to, and to the temples of the gods and goddesses that form the main pieces of our itinerary, we could see which of the deities and which of the places had special significance for each individual. And so when a person went there and they knew that they had let's say Delphi conjunct their moon, it was okay, this is like an old home of yours. And they could then go into a meditative or healing state to feel deeply their connections with these ancient energies and to bring them forward into their consciousness, into the present. And this, in fact, was part of an ancient mode of healing, and that from which our word therapy, therapia, comes from. And in a very early time period, when a person became ill, the belief was it was because they had offended some god or goddess who then sent the illness. And so the process was to then go to an oracle to find out like who you'd gotten mad at you. And then to be told, like, go to their site and make an offering and maybe become initiated into their mysteries. And in this way, you can make amends and effect a healing. And the word therapia comes from a word which means attendance upon the gods. So in this way, through our sacred site travel, we could find out which god was key in us through the planets and the asteroids. If it was in a troubled place, let's say maybe it had difficult aspects with Mars or Saturn, maybe it was in the 12th house or the 8th house, and there was some angst associated with it, then by going to that site and bringing flowers, like bringing honey, like singing a song, reading a poem to that god or goddess, going into a meditative state, praying, one could facilitate a process of self-healing.
Of course. So was there like a preparation process before the pilgrimages? Because as you explained it, it was a very healing experience for most of those who went with you. Did they have to get the chart read beforehand?
No. Many of the people who came had some astrological background. So it wasn't as if they had to learn astrology, but they're often friends who came with their friends of astrologers who came, but they're in this larger group of, everyone talking astrology, and, it filtered out. But I did provide charts for everyone with the asteroids written in of where we were going, and then highlighting which ones were especially emphasized for them. So in that way, they knew ahead of time when they went somewhere that this was one of their spots. And then we allowed them to, and I always prepared a reading booklet for people with a lot of background information. Some people read it and all the supplemental reading. Other people didn't want to read anything. They just wanted to have the experience. So however it is that it worked best was okay. Like there are no quizzes, right, going on. So it was flexible. But we also began to see how when you focus on an archetypal deity, that the symbols begin to appear in the course of your travels. And I remember one year doing a trip with Brian Clark and Melanie Reinhardt, and we were focusing on Chiron, especially in the healers. And the first day that we were in Athens and going to some of the places, including the temple of Asclepius, who was one of Chiron's students. Chiron was known for his dog that always accompanied him. And this black dog showed up outside our hotel and followed us for 2 days in the course of the group going around, talking about Chiron and going to different places. And then we were finished with the teaching and the dog trotted on and left us. And I could, recount dozens of stories like that. But that was part of the magic of bringing in the archetypes and realizing that they continue to be a living presence.
Well, I can only imagine how that must have felt to both you and, your friends on the trip.
Yeah.
But moving on a little bit from the subject
Yeah.
of the pilgrimages. As a curiosity, I wanted to know if you had an opportunity to explore any Italian authors or astrologers in your work.
Because I'm not familiar with the language, I've not. But if you have some books by Italian authors that are in English translation that you could send me in an email, I would love to be able to connect with those.
For sure, I'll surely do that. I wanted to ask also, since everyone is talking about the age of Aquarius and what this movement is going to mean for the whole of humanity, I wanted to know your point of view, and especially since you focus so much on the energy of the goddesses and the feminine, what do you think the age of Aquarius is going to bring? And if you can go in depth about what it's going to bring for women, especially?
Okay, that's a more difficult question. Because the construct on which the precessional ages is based, I feel may not be altogether accurate. And if it's based on the intersection of the tropical zodiac with the sidereal zodiac due to the precessional movement of the earth, then that point moves against the constellations of the stars. And the constellations of the stars are not an equal 30-degree arc of the circle. And many of the constellations overlap. So it's hard to actually identify when a certain age begins and when it ends based upon the actual stars in the sky. So that's problem number one with that model. I don't know, do you want to hear my second problem with it, or is that enough?
Sure.
That we talk about when it's been the age of Aries, well, the age of Aries, that many of the symbols of the lamb and the ram all came into being, and the age of Taurus was the cow, and so on. But the constellations and or the signs hadn't yet been named as such during the historical periods when their imagery was supposed to have influenced the culture of the society. And that actual distinction didn't happen till around maybe 1900 BC by the Assyrians in Mesopotamia. So it's challenging to project back 3,000 or 4,000 years before that point and say that that symbolism was shaping the religious beliefs of a culture. So for those reasons, it's like when we get into the age of Aquarius, it's like, oh, I have some problems going there. But we can certainly talk about Pluto in Aquarius.
Of course. Yeah. Because what I've heard and what I've been able to read is Pluto moving into Aquarius, it's going to be a long stay, and it's supposed to bring about considerable change and even drastic, evolution from the point of view of human rights. Would you agree with that statement?
Well, I think certainly what it means to be human is going to go into a massive transformation. And from Hellenistic astrology, there were 3 of the 12 zodiac signs that were considered to be human as opposed to bestial. And what that means is, like, the bull is an animal and the ram is an animal. But Aquarius, being the water pourer, is a human form. And Virgo, of the virgin holding the shaft of wheat, is a human form. And Gemini, the twins, are a human form. And sometimes even Libra, but Libra is so-so. And so these were called human signs. And so Aquarius being one of them, and Pluto is the principle of transformation. Like, our question is, what does it mean to be human in the age of AI, when the machines that we are creating are rapidly outstripping the speed and thoroughness by which information can be processed, integrated, and made sense of? That this was something that had been unique to the human mind, but now that's going somewhere else. And so I think that's going to be one of the profound transformations that are coming up. And then I also wonder, in terms of the feminine, if we aren't moving more into, let's see, it's challenging to find the right vocabulary now to say what I want to say. And that some of the polarization that has up to this point been manifested into the extremes of, let's say, masculine and feminine, that ancient astrology said you have masculine signs, you have feminine signs, you have men, you have women. And then there was a third place that Mercury lived in that could be both and. And we're seeing a greater expansion of that middle sort of making less tension between the extremes of polarization. And I think that in one way, as that happens, I hope that there will be less repression and subjugation of what it means to be feminine, as both ends move increasingly to a more unified and integrated center point.
Wow. Thank you again. Well, as a last question to end our interview, I'd love to know, what do you think the future of astrology has in store? Like, how do you think it will evolve, considering the fast pace that technology is moving at?
Yeah, it's going to be incredibly exciting. I mean, there are 2 parts of the excitement. The one is the translation of the ancient texts. And whenever that has happened, whenever one culture has received the astrology of an earlier culture and translated into its own language, it happened in Persia in the 6th century, in Baghdad in the 8th century, in Spain in the 12th century, in the United States and Europe in the 20th century. There's been a huge explosion of new thinking and revitalization, a sort of renaissance. And so this has, in fact, been happening in the last 25 years, coming from the past. But going into the future, with so many more celestial bodies being discovered, the solar system is greatly expanding, the universe is greatly expanding. We're seeing that the universe is so much vaster and bigger than we can possibly imagine. And with all of the trans-Neptunian and trans-Plutonian planets, of the hundreds of thousands of asteroids and those coming in, there are many, many more astrological variables that we will be able to bring into understanding the richness and complexity of the human nature. And because of the explosion of AI, the same thing is happening inside of our brains. I mean, AI is almost a projection of our inner neural processes that are being lit up, that it's going to be a fascinating, rich, bold new world, that we have the foundation of the very beginnings of our tradition to rest on as we reach out and touch, other galaxies and systems, and understand how we are not just part of our planet or part of our solar system or even part of our galaxy, but we're children and beings of the universe, and how our astrology can open us up to that awareness.
Well, it does make perfect sense.
Yeah.
Well, I can only thank you again so much for joining us, and I hope you enjoyed our time with us.
Yeah, it was lovely. And thank you for your wonderful questions and your beautiful smile that helped made me feel very comfortable in sharing. And I would love to hear from the people in Italy.
Of course.
Okay.
Well, I'll get in touch with the team to see about sending you those emails. And
Okay,
thank you
good.
so much again.
Okay, so all best wishes to everyone. Okay,
Thank
bye.
you.